The sun bled crimson across the endless prairie, painting the sky like a wound that refused to heal. A woman lay crumpled in the dust, her tattered dress clinging to her sweat-soaked skin. Her name was Eliza Mayhew, and she was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. Hours earlier, the wagon train she'd pinned her hopes on had abandoned her, their wheels churning westward without so much as a backward glance. They'd called her a burden, a widow with no skills, no strength, no worth. Her crime? Weakness in a world that worshipped resilience. Now, as vultures circled overhead, her shallow breaths mingled with the dry wind, and she wondered if this was where her story would end. Eliza had joined the wagon train in St. Louis, a 28-year-old widow chasing whispers of a better life in Oregon. She'd sold everything, her late husband's blacksmith tools, her mother's silver locket, to afford the journey. Thomas, her husband, had died of fever 2 years prior, leaving her with nothing but grief and a stubborn will to survive. The wagon train was her salvation, or so she thought. She'd offered to cook, mend clothes, anything to prove her worth, but her hands trembled from exhaustion, and her body, weakened by months of meager rations, betrayed her. The train's leader, a stern man named Hargrove, had grown impatient. "You're slowing us down," he'd spat, his voice cold as the iron on his belt. When she'd collapsed during a river crossing, soaked and shivering, they'd voted to leave her behind. No one spoke for her. Not even Mary, the kind-eyed woman she'd shared stories with under starlit nights. They left her with a single canteen and a threadbare blanket, their wagons vanishing into the horizon. Now, as the sun dipped lower, Eliza's vision blurred. Her lips cracked, her throat burned, and the weight of her abandonment pressed heavier than the heat. She whispered Thomas's name, an apology for failing him, for failing herself. The world grew dim, and she closed her eyes, surrendering to the prairie's vast indifference. Miles away, a lone cowboy named Caleb Holt rode across the same endless plain. His horse, a sturdy bay named Juniper, snorted as they crested a low hill. Caleb was 32, a man carved by loss and solitude. His weathered hat-shaded eyes that had seen too much bandits, droughts, and the graves of those he'd failed to save. He'd been a ranch hand once, dreaming of a homestead with his sister, Clara, but smallpox had taken her 3 years ago. Since then, Caleb had wandered, taking odd jobs, avoiding ties that could break him again. He was no hero, just a man who knew the land's cruelty and how to survive it. His only companion was Juniper, and even she seemed to judge his restless heart. Caleb spotted the vultures first, their lazy spirals a grim omen. He urged Juniper forward, his gut tightening. As he drew closer, he saw her, Eliza, a fragile figure in the dirt, her chestnut hair matted with dust. He dismounted, his boots crunching against the earth. She was alive, barely, her breaths shallow but stubborn. Her canteen was empty, her blanket useless against the sun's wrath. Caleb knelt beside her, his calloused hands gentle as he brushed hair from her face. "Hold on, ma'am," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she could hear. He lifted her, her weight slight as a child's, and carried her to Juniper. The horse nickered, as if sensing the urgency. Caleb tied Eliza's blanket around her, securing her against his chest, and rode toward his camp, a small setup near a creek where he'd planned to rest for the night. At camp, Caleb laid Eliza on his bedroll, her frail form swallowed by his spare coat. He built a fire, its crackle a defiant stand against the gathering dusk. He trickled water from his canteen into her mouth, her lips parting instinctively. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever, and she whispered, "Why?" Caleb didn't answer. He didn't know why, not yet. He only knew he couldn't leave her to die. Over the next hours, he tended her with a quiet focus, boiling herbs for a makeshift tea, checking her pulse, and draping his own blanket over her when she shivered. The night was long, filled with the howl of distant coyotes and the weight of her fragile survival. By dawn, Eliza's fever broke. Her eyes, now clear, met Caleb's. They were hazel, flecked with gold, and carried a grief he recognized. "You found me," she said, her voice hoarse. Caleb nodded, stirring the fire. "Couldn't leave you out there." She told him her story in halting words, the wagon train, Hargrove's cruelty, the betrayal of those she'd trusted. Caleb listened, his jaw tight. He knew the type, men like Hargrove who measured worth in labor and discarded anything less. He told her little of himself, only that he was a drifter, heading nowhere in particular.
But when she asked if he'd take her to the next settlement, he hesitated. Settlements meant people, and people meant complications. Yet her eyes, raw with hope and fear, stirred something in him he thought long buried. The journey to Fort Laramie, the nearest settlement, would take a week. Caleb agreed to take her, though he warned her the trail was unforgiving. Eliza, still weak, insisted she could handle it. She'd lost everything, she said, but not her will to keep going. Caleb admired her grit, even if he doubted her strength. They set out at first light, Eliza riding behind him on Juniper, her arms wrapped around his waist. The prairie stretched endless before them, a sea of grass hiding dangers, rattlesnakes, sudden storms, and roving outlaws. Caleb kept his rifle close, his eyes scanning the horizon. Their first challenge came on the third day. A sudden squall swept across the plain, rain lashing like a whip. Caleb found shelter in a shallow cave, but Eliza's cough worsened, her body trembling despite the fire he built. He shared his last strip of jerky, lying that he wasn't hungry. She saw through him but ate, her gratitude silent but profound. That night, as the storm raged, Eliza spoke of Thomas, his laugh, his dreams of a farm, the way he'd hum off-key to make her smile. Caleb, usually guarded, shared a memory of Clara, how she'd braid wildflowers into Juniper's mane. The shared grief wove a fragile bond, two broken souls finding solace in the other's scars. The next hurdle was human. On the fifth day, they crossed paths with a trio of drifters, their eyes gleaming with greed at the sight of Juniper and Caleb's gear. Caleb's hand rested on his rifle, his voice low but firm. "Move on, boys. Ain't nothing for you here." The leader, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, laughed, but something in Caleb's stare, cold, unyielding, made them back off. Eliza, clutching the blanket around her, whispered her thanks. Caleb only nodded, but inside, he felt a flicker of purpose he hadn't known in years. As they neared Fort Laramie, Eliza grew stronger, her cough fading, her steps surer. She began to help with camp tasks, gathering kindling, mending a tear in Caleb's shirt with clumsy but earnest stitches. They talked more, their silences less heavy. Eliza shared her dream of starting anew, maybe teaching children to read, something Thomas had always encouraged. Caleb, for the first time, spoke of a half-forgotten dream, a small ranch, a place to call home. The idea felt less impossible with her listening. On the seventh day, Fort Laramie's wooden palisades came into view. Eliza's heart sank. She'd grown used to Caleb's quiet presence, the safety of his shadow. At the fort's gate, she turned to him, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "You don't have to stay, Caleb. You've done more than anyone would." He looked at her, then at the fort, its bustle a reminder of the world he'd avoided. "Maybe I'll stick around a bit," he said, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "Make sure you don't get into more trouble." Eliza settled in Fort Laramie, finding work as a seamstress while saving for her teaching dream. Caleb took a job at a nearby stable, his wandering days paused, if not ended. They weren't lovers, not yet, but they were no longer alone. The prairie had taken much from them both, but it had given them this, a chance to heal, to trust, to hope. As the sun sets over Fort Laramie, painting the sky crimson once more, the camera pans to the horizon. The narrator's voice, warm and steady, speaks to you, the viewer. The world can be cruel, casting off those it deems weak. But sometimes, in the vastness of that cruelty, one soul finds another. And in that finding, there's hope, not just to survive, but to live. To build something new from the ashes of what was lost. The screen fades to black, leaving you with a message: no matter how broken you feel, there's someone, somewhere, who will carry you to safety. And together, you can find your way home.